We've seen that in perfect capital markets, payout policy is basically irrelevant, and so uh, now we move towards some real world imperfections, just like we did when we looked at capital structure. And so one of the impacts that one of the things that will impact uh, whether or not payout policy matters is taxes. And in the real world, we do have taxes on dividends and taxes on capital gains. So, so that is going to dictate some of managers' decisions in terms of what payout policy will actually look like. So dividends are taxed according to the dividend tax rate. There's a special tax rate specifically for dividends, whereas shares sold, which can also be referred to as a homemade dividend, essentially investors, if they want to receive a dividend but can't because the firm isn't issuing them, investors always have the decision to sell shares. And so when you sell shares, you're taxed according to the capital gains tax rate. The term capital gain just means the change in price for a share of stock. So you can get taxed if you sell a share of stock for more than you paid for it. That's what the term capital gain actually means, is selling the shares at a price that's different from what you paid for it. So uh, so looking at this diagram here, we have tax rates for dividends and long-term capital gains for investors in the highest tax bracket. There are different taxes depending on how long you've held shares. So for now, what we're looking at is long-term capital gains specifically. And you see over the course of time, capital gains and dividends were oftentimes taxed very differently. So from 1971 to 78, capital gains were taxed at a 35% rate and dividends were taxed at a 70% rate. And so here there's a substantial difference where dividends are taxed at twice the amount that capital gains were. So it would be advantageous for a shareholder to be able to get some sort of cash payout by selling shares instead of by receiving dividends. 1979 to 81, that tax advantage became even greater, where the capital gains tax was reduced. So you see over time there's some convergence into how capital gains and dividends are taxed, and a little bit of divergence once you start getting into the early and mid 90s and the early 2000s. But since 2003, capital gains and dividends were largely taxed at the same rate. This actually goes through 2016 at least, where dividends and capital gains are taxed at the same rate. So what does this mean to the financial manager in terms of payout policy? Well, if dividends are taxed at a higher rate than capital gains, then shareholders, who are the owners of the firm and who the managers are supposed to look out for, would prefer share repurchases to dividends, because essentially the shareholders would have the largest after-tax cash flow from collecting cash at the lowest possible tax rate. So historically, as we see, it was pretty often that dividends were taxed at a higher rate than capital gains, so dividends would have made more sense. Now, over time, that overall policy has somewhat shifted, and since 2003, capital gains and dividends have been taxed at the same rate. So what does it mean if they're actually taxed at the same rate? Well, if they're taxed at the same rate, there's still a tax advantage for share repurchases over dividends. Because what you do with a share repurchase is the share repurchase itself is voluntary. Shareholders don't have to sell back their shares to the firm if they don't want to. And so you're putting it in the shareholders' hands to defer any sort of tax payments on capital gains until the shareholder decides to sell. So in the end, uh, if share repurchases and dividends are taxed at the same rate, which has been the case since the early 2000s, if they're taxed at the same rate, shareholders should have a tendency to prefer repurchases over dividends because that gives them their largest after-tax cash flow. So what does that mean in terms of optimal dividend policy? When the dividend tax rate exceeds the capital gain tax rate, you pay no dividends at all. Essentially, you should prefer share repurchases because the share repurchase will put the largest after-tax amount, because you want to put the largest after-tax cash flow into your shareholders' pockets as possible. And that's what we see. What we see historically, the dividend tax rate has been much larger than the capital gains tax rate. Even more recently now, capital gains and dividends are taxed at the same rate. And when dividends and capital gains are taxed at the same rate, there's still a tax advantage when taxed at the same rate. Share repurchases that result in capital gains are still preferred over dividends. And it's because investors can choose when they get taxed. There's some time value in not getting taxed until later. And so ultimately, the only time that a dividend would be considered preferable to a share repurchase is if the dividend is taxed at a lower rate. So what do we see firms doing in practice? Here we see a chart where the percentage of firms making payouts is on the vertical axis. So this is the percentage of firms paying anything out. And the horizontal axis is just what year we see. And so blue refers to payouts as dividends only. Green refers to payouts as payouts being repurchases only. And then this red is a joint policy where you have firms that will issue payouts both by share repurchases and by issuing dividends. And so what we see historically, essentially before 1980, so in the 70s, the vast majority of firms paying out, you see about 50% of firms were making payouts through dividends alone. Only if you look at these green lines, only about 5 to 10% at most of firms were using repurchases only, and then you had another about 20% or so of firms making some sort of joint payout policy where they issued dividends and repurchases. So a repurchase policy only was relatively rare. You had about 50% of firms paying out through dividends only, another 20% using dividends and share repurchases, and only 10% using repurchases only, with 20% of the firms that are left over not making any payouts at all. So, moving forward, fast forward down the timeline, by the time you get to 2000, by the time you get to about 2000, there was only about 25% or so of firms that that their sole payout policy was dividends alone. That number increases back to about 40% in 2015. But if you look at the number of firms who were issuing repurchases only, that number has expanded. You see the size of this diagram goes up substantially over time. And a lot of that probably has to do with managers realizing the tax benefits that share repurchases have over dividends. This middle ground stays relatively steady, but actually maybe decreases a little bit over time, where in the late 70s, about 20% of firms had a dividend and repurchase policy, whereas when you get to 2015, that narrows to about maybe 10 to 15% of firms having a joint policy. So overall, if you look at the total amount of firms using share repurchases in some form or another, that has expanded quite a bit, and even more so, what has expanded a lot is firms using repurchases only. So overall, the percent of firms using repurchases has expanded over time. The percentage of firms using dividends declined, but recently has partially reversed. But overall, the general trend in terms of payout policy has been increased reliance on share repurchases. And this is probably, at least in part, due to the fact that repurchases do have a tax advantage relative to issuing dividends.